Marcus Sterling's hand froze mid-reach toward the DNA results scattered across his mahogany desk, his wedding ring catching the morning light. The woman he'd just fired, Ruby Mae Johnson, wasn't just another failed nanny. The test results screamed impossible truths. Mason wasn't his biological son. His coffee mug shattered against the marble floor, the sound echoing through the empty mansion like a gunshot. Security footage still played on his monitor, Ruby Mae walking away with her single worn suitcase, the twins' desperate screams following her down the driveway. The irony twisted in his chest like broken glass. 17 educated, certified nannies had failed with his boys. But this poor black maid from East Palo Alto had done what seemed impossible, made his traumatized children laugh again, sleep peacefully, call someone mama for the first time since Eleanor's death. "Get her back," he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking. But how do you explain that the woman you dismissed might hold the key to everything? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, the Sterling mansion had stood like a fortress of grief in the hills of Palo Alto, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. Marcus Sterling sat in his home office at 3 a.m., surrounded by 17 resignation letters from nannies who'd fled his household in defeat. The latest, Jessica Martinez, had lasted exactly 4 days before the twins locked her in the supply closet and refused to let her out until she promised never to return. His boys hadn't spoken a complete sentence to anyone since Eleanor's funeral 8 months ago. Mason, the gentler twin, communicated only through violent nightmares that sent him screaming down the hallways. Miles expressed himself through calculated destruction. Yesterday's victim had been a priceless Ming vase that Eleanor had cherished. The child psychologist spoke in careful euphemisms about adjustment disorders and complex grief responses. But Marcus knew the brutal truth. His sons were drowning, and he was too broken to save them. The employment agency had sent their regrets. No more candidates. The Sterling family had become industry legend, the household where careers went to die. Even the most experienced childcare professionals whispered warnings about the cursed mansion, where 2 5-year-old boys had defeated every expert the Bay Area could offer. Ruby Mae Johnson arrived on that January morning like an answered prayer wrapped in second-hand clothes. She stepped off the city bus at the bottom of his driveway because her 15-year-old Honda had finally surrendered to time and poverty. Her interview outfit, a navy dress with careful patches and shoes worn thin at the heels, told the story of someone who knew struggle intimately but refused to let it define her dignity. The agency had scraped the bottom of their barrel to send her no degree in child development, no references from previous wealthy families, just 23 years of raising other people's children while grieving the loss of her own, and a voice on the phone that carried something the others had lacked: genuine warmth instead of professional politeness. When Marcus opened the front door, he saw immediately why the agency had hesitated. Ruby Mae Johnson was nothing like the parade of credentialed professionals who'd marched through his home. At 58, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who'd survived multiple lifetimes of heartbreak. Her skin told stories of long days in California sun, her hands bore the calluses of honest work, and her eyes held a depth that spoke of understanding pain from the inside out. But it was her reaction to the mansion's oppressive silence that stopped him cold. While other candidates had assessed the luxury with calculating eyes, Ruby Mae simply listened. She heard what he'd grown deaf to: the absence of children's laughter, the echo of rooms too large for the small hearts beating within them, the particular quality of grief that settles into expensive furniture and makes it feel like a mausoleum. "Mr. Sterling," she said quietly, her voice carrying the cadence of southern roots transplanted to California soil, "where are your babies?" For the first time in months, Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. She hadn't asked about salary, benefits, or job responsibilities. She'd asked about his children. The first sign that Ruby Mae Johnson was different came within minutes of her arrival. While other nannies had demanded tours of the mansion's amenities, she asked only to see the children's rooms. Marcus led her up the curved staircase, past Eleanor's portrait that still watched over the foyer like a beautiful ghost, and down the hallway where 17 previous caregivers had met their defeat. The twins' bedroom door stood slightly ajar, and from within came the sound that had become the soundtrack of Marcus's guilt, silence punctuated by Mason's quiet whimpering. Ruby Mae paused at the threshold, her weathered hand resting on the doorframe, and did something no other candidate had attempted. She listened, not with the clinical attention of a professional, but with the instinctive focus of someone who understood that children's pain spoke its own language. "They're scared," she whispered, and Marcus felt his throat tighten because someone finally saw what the child psychologists had missed beneath their diagnostic terminology. When Ruby Mae stepped into the room, both boys looked up from where they huddled together on Mason's bed, their identical green eyes, Eleanor's eyes, wide with the wariness of small animals who'd learned that adults brought disappointment. Miles clutched his brother's hand protectively, while Mason pressed his face into his twin's shoulder. Both of them braced for another stranger who would promise to help and then abandon them when the job proved too hard. But Ruby Mae didn't approach with the forced cheerfulness that had characterized her predecessors. Instead, she lowered herself to the floor with careful grace, her arthritic knees protesting silently, and simply sat. She didn't speak, didn't offer toys or treats or the hollow promises that had lost their meaning. She just existed in their space, patient as morning light, until curiosity began to overcome fear. Mason was the first to break. His thumb found its way to his mouth, a habit the therapists were trying to eliminate, and he peered at this new person who seemed content to wait forever. Miles maintained his protective stance, but Marcus noticed his death grip on his brother's hand had loosened slightly. "My name's Ruby Mae," she said finally, her voice carrying the warm honey of Georgia summers despite decades in California. "And I'm very sorry about your mama." The words hit the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the careful avoidance that everyone else had practiced. Therapists spoke of processing loss, relatives whispered about moving forward, but Ruby Mae had done the unthinkable. She'd acknowledged Eleanor's absence as the living, breathing presence it had become. Miles's composure cracked first. His lower lip trembled, and the rage that had been his armor for 8 months dissolved into the raw grief beneath. "She's not coming back," he whispered, the first words he'd spoken to a stranger since the funeral. "No, baby," Ruby Mae agreed, her own voice thick with understanding. "She's not coming back. And that hurts something fierce, doesn't it?" Mason lifted his head from his brother's shoulder, tears streaming down his face. "The other ladies said she was watching from heaven. They said we should be happy." Ruby Mae's expression darkened with protective anger. "Well, that's the biggest pile of nonsense I ever heard. You don't have to be happy about losing your mama. You don't have to be anything but exactly what you are right now, 2 little boys who miss their mama something terrible." Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, watching 17 months of suppressed emotion pour out of his children like water from a broken dam. Miles climbed down from the bed and walked slowly toward Ruby Mae, his small fists clenched at his sides. "I'm mad at her," he confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm mad she left us with Daddy and he doesn't know how to make pancakes shaped like butterflies, and he forgets to sing the bedtime song, and he cries in his office when he thinks we can't hear him." Instead of offering hollow reassurances, Ruby Mae nodded with solemn understanding. "Being mad at someone you love for leaving, that's one of the hardest feelings in the whole world. Takes a brave boy to say it out loud." Mason had crept closer too, drawn by the gravitational pull of someone who didn't flinch away from their pain. "Do you have children?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruby May's face transformed, grief and love warring in her expression. "I had a little girl named Sarah. She'd be about your age now if she was still here." "Where is she?" Miles asked with the brutal honesty of childhood. She's with your mama," Ruby May said simply, "and I miss her every single day, but missing someone doesn't mean you stop living. It means you carry their love with you while you figure out how to be happy again." For the first time in 8 months, both boys approached an adult without fear, drawn by the magnetic pull of authentic grief that matched their own. 2 weeks into Ruby May's employment, the impossible began to feel inevitable. The twins who had terrorized 17 trained professionals now followed her through the mansion like devoted shadows, their laughter echoing through rooms that had known only silence since Eleanor's death. Marcus found himself arriving home earlier each day, drawn by curiosity about the transformation occurring under his own roof. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening when Marcus returned from his San Francisco office to find his security system showing unusual activity. The motion sensors in the twins' bedroom had been triggered repeatedly throughout the night, but instead of the familiar pattern of nightmares and crying, the readings showed sustained, gentle movement. Concerned, he pulled up the archived footage on his phone. What he saw stopped him cold in the marble foyer, rainwater still dripping from his coat. At 2:30 a.m., Mason had awakened screaming from another nightmare about the bad man taking Mama away. But instead of the usual chaos, thrashing, crying, the eventual exhaustion that left both boys hollow-eyed by morning, Ruby May had appeared in the doorway like a guardian angel in flannel pajamas. Without hesitation, she'd gathered both children into her arms, settling into the rocking chair that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. For 3 hours, she'd held them while they slept, her weathered hands stroking their hair, her voice humming lullabies that seemed to reach some primal place of comfort. When Miles stirred with the beginning of his own nightmare, she'd whispered words too soft for the microphone to catch, and he'd settled back into peaceful sleep against her shoulder. Marcus had watched the timestamp advance through the night, mesmerized by the sight of his broken children, finally at rest. Ruby May had never moved, never shifted them away when her arms must have ached, never once appeared anything but grateful for the privilege of comforting them. As dawn broke through the bedroom windows, she'd carefully transferred each boy back to his own bed, tucked the covers around their shoulders, and kissed their foreheads with the reverence of a benediction. Now, standing in his foyer with his phone still displaying that final image, Ruby May smoothing Mason's hair one last time before leaving them to wake naturally, Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. This woman, who earned less in a year than he spent on a single business dinner, had given his children something his millions couldn't buy: the security of unconditional presence. But his moment of revelation was interrupted by the sound of adult voices in heated discussion coming from the kitchen. He recognized Ruby May's calm tones, but the second voice made his blood run cold. Victoria Caldwell, Eleanor's sister, had arrived unannounced. Marcus approached quietly, some instinct warning him to observe before revealing himself. Through the doorway he could see Victoria in her signature power suit, every blonde hair in place despite the rain, her manicured fingers drumming against the granite countertop with predatory patience. Ruby May stood at the sink continuing to wash the twins' lunch dishes, while Victoria circled like a shark, sensing blood in the water. "I'm just concerned about the boys' welfare," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the honeyed poison that had made her a formidable family law attorney. "Marcus is clearly struggling with single parenthood, and hiring someone without proper credentials seems impulsive." Ruby May's hands never paused in their gentle scrubbing of the butterfly-shaped plate that Mason had finally eaten from that morning, a breakthrough that had taken weeks of patient coaxing. "The boys are thriving," she replied simply. "They're eating, sleeping, and starting to heal. Isn't that what matters?" Victoria's laugh held no warmth. "Healing. Is that what we're calling it when children become overly attached to hired help? Mason told me yesterday that he wished you were his real mama. Surely you can see how inappropriate that is." The plate slipped from Ruby May's hands, clattering against the porcelain sink. For the first time since her arrival, Marcus saw her composure crack. "Children process grief differently," she said quietly. "Mason's attachment isn't inappropriate. It's natural. He needs to feel safe loving someone again." "But what happens when you leave?" Victoria pressed, moving closer with the calculated aggression of a closing argument. "When Marcus realizes this arrangement isn't sustainable, when someone points out that a high school dropout from East Palo Alto isn't equipped to raise children who will inherit a billion-dollar empire, what happens to their little hearts then?" Ruby May turned from the sink, her dark eyes blazing with protective fury. "I would never abandon those boys. Never. They've lost enough." "Everyone says that," Victoria replied with cruel satisfaction. "But let's be realistic. You're working 3 jobs to afford rent on a trailer. Marcus pays you what he spends on wine in a week. How long before you realize this isn't charity work, it's employment, and employees can always be replaced with better qualified candidates?" Marcus felt the words hit him like physical blows. Victoria was voicing every ugly truth he'd been trying to ignore. The vast gulf between Ruby May's world and his own, the precarious nature of their arrangement, the inevitable moment when his children's hearts would be broken again. But watching Ruby May's face transform with determination, he realized he'd underestimated the strength of her resolve. "You think I'm here for money?" Ruby May asked, her voice carrying the quiet dignity of someone who'd been underestimated her entire life. "Lady, I make more cleaning office buildings than I do watching your nephews. I'm here because those babies needed someone to stay when everyone else left. I'm here because love doesn't require a degree, it requires showing up." Victoria's smile turned predatory. "How noble. But what you call love, others might call overstepping boundaries. I wonder what Child Protective Services would think about the sleeping arrangements I've been hearing about." An unrelated woman spending nights in children's bedrooms. In certain circles, that raises questions. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Marcus stepped into the kitchen, his presence causing both women to turn. "Victoria," he said coldly, "I think it's time for you to leave." The months that followed Victoria's threat transformed the Sterling household into something Marcus had never experienced, a real home. Ruby May's presence had woven itself so seamlessly into their daily fabric that he sometimes forgot she wasn't family by blood. She arrived each morning at 6:30, her key turning in the lock, followed by the soft sounds of breakfast preparation that had become the twins' favorite alarm clock. By the time Marcus emerged from his bedroom, she'd have coffee waiting in his favorite mug and the boys dressed and fed, their backpacks packed with lunch boxes decorated with encouraging notes written in her careful cursive. The transformation in Mason and Miles was nothing short of miraculous. Mason had returned to his art, filling sketchpad after sketchpad with drawings of their new life. Stick figures labeled Daddy, Mama Ruby, and me and Miles standing under rainbow skies beside a house that looked suspiciously like their mansion, but with exaggerated hearts floating from its windows. Miles had channeled his protective instincts into becoming Ruby May's self-appointed assistant, following her through grocery stores with military precision, ensuring no one spoke rudely to his Mama Ruby. But it was the quiet moments that revealed the depth of their bond. Marcus would find Ruby May sitting with Mason during his weekly nightmares, not trying to banish the bad dreams, but teaching him to breathe through them, to name his fears so they'd lose their power over him. She'd discovered that Miles's explosive anger stemmed from his inability to articulate his grief, so she'd created a feelings jar where he could deposit written descriptions of his emotions, a ritual that had reduced his tantrums to manageable conversations about hurt and fear and the terrible weight of missing his mother. The outside world had begun to take notice. At the exclusive Palo Alto Country Club, where Marcus maintained a membership more for business than pleasure, other parents had started approaching him with curious questions about his children's remarkable recovery. The twins, who'd been known throughout their social circle as those poor Sterling boys, had transformed into confident, articulate children who spoke openly about their grief without being consumed by it. Dr. Patricia Hensley, the child psychologist who'd been treating the twins since Eleanor's death, had requested a meeting that Marcus had been dreading. He'd expected criticism, perhaps recommendations for additional therapy, but instead found himself facing a woman whose professional composure barely concealed her amazement. "In 23 years of practice," she'd said, reviewing her notes with evident bewilderment, "I've never seen such rapid, sustainable progress in childhood grief recovery. Whatever you're doing at home, Mr. Sterling, it's working in ways that traditional therapy couldn't achieve." Marcus had wanted to credit Ruby May entirely, but some instinct warned him against revealing too much. Victoria's threat still echoed in his mind, and he'd begun to notice the careful way certain people looked at his family when they appeared together in public. The lingering stares, the whispered conversations that ceased when he approached. California might pride itself on progressive values, but the sight of a wealthy white widower with his black housekeeper and mixed-race-appearing children still drew attention that made him uncomfortable for reasons he was only beginning to understand. The first sign of real trouble came through Marcus's business partner, Jonathan Webb, during what should have been a routine quarterly meeting. Jonathan had been unusually fidgety, avoiding eye contact while discussing profit margins and market projections. Finally, over their third glass of wine, he'd broached the subject that had clearly been weighing on him. "Look, Marcus, this is awkward as hell, but some of the board members have been asking questions about your home situation, about the woman who's been seen with your kids at school functions." Marcus had set down his wine glass with deliberate calm. "Ruby May Johnson is my children's nanny." "What questions could there possibly be?" Jonathan had shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, his face flushed with more than wine. "It's not about her qualifications. Everyone can see the kids are thriving. It's about optics. Sterling Tech is going public next year. We're talking about a $40 billion valuation. Some investors are concerned about perception issues." The euphemisms had hung in the air like smoke, their meaning crystal clear despite the careful language. Marcus had felt a rage unlike anything he'd experienced since Eleanor's death. Not the wild, unfocused anger of early grief, but a cold, surgical fury that demanded precise action. "Perception issues," he'd repeated slowly. "You mean they're concerned about a black woman caring for white children?" Jonathan's silence had been answer enough. That evening, Marcus had found Ruby May in the garden with the twins, teaching them to identify different varieties of roses that Eleanor had planted years before. The sight of Mason carefully sketching a bloom while Ruby May guided his hand and Miles earnestly taking notes about proper watering techniques had nearly undone his resolve to address the growing pressure. But Ruby May possessed an intuition that seemed almost supernatural when it came to emotional undercurrents. After the boys had been tucked into bed with their usual ritual of stories and songs, she'd found Marcus in his office, staring at financial projections without really seeing them. "Something's troubling you," she'd said simply. settling into the chair across from his desk with the comfortable familiarity that had developed between them over the months. Marcus had tried to deflect, to maintain the employer-employee boundary that had long since dissolved in practice, if not in theory. But Ruby May's patient silence had drawn the truth from him like infection from a wound. He'd told her about Jonathan's warnings, about the board's concerns, about the whispered conversations at school functions and country club events. He'd watched her face remain carefully neutral as he described the impossible position they'd all been placed in, her competence and dedication questioned not for any professional failing, but for the accident of her birth that made their arrangement socially complicated. When he'd finished, Ruby May had sat quietly for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Outside, the automatic sprinklers had begun their nightly cycle, the gentle sound of water on leaves filling the silence between them. "Mr. Sterling?" she'd said finally, her voice carrying a weariness that seemed to encompass decades of similar conversations. "I've been black in America for 58 years. I know what people see when they look at us together. I know what they whisper about a woman like me caring for children like yours." Marcus had started to protest, to offer reassurances about his own colorblindness and the irrelevance of others' opinions, but Ruby May had raised a gentle hand to stop him. "But here's what I also know," she'd continued, her voice gaining strength. "Those boys upstairs sleep through the night now. They eat their vegetables without being asked. They talk about their mama without falling apart, and they're learning that love doesn't end with death. It just changes shape. That's what matters, not what some investors think about the color of my skin." Her words had settled over Marcus like a benediction, but also like a challenge. For the first time since hiring her, he'd been forced to confront the complex reality of their situation, not just as employer and employee, but as two adults navigating the treacherous waters of American racial dynamics while trying to protect two vulnerable children. The conversation had been interrupted by the soft patter of bare feet in the hallway. Mason had appeared in the doorway, his favorite stuffed elephant clutched against his chest, tears streaming down his face. "I had the bad dream again," he'd whispered, "but this time the bad man was taking Mama Ruby away instead of Mama Eleanor." Ruby May had immediately opened her arms, and Mason had launched himself into her embrace with the desperate intensity of someone clinging to a lifeline. As she'd carried him back toward the stairs, murmuring soft reassurances, she'd paused at the office doorway. "Mr. Sterling," she'd said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy, "that little boy's nightmare might not stay a dream if we don't figure out how to protect what we've built here." The next morning had brought the first direct assault on their fragile stability. Marcus had awakened to find his phone buzzing with notifications from an unknown number. Someone had created a social media account dedicated to exposing what they called the Sterling situation. Photos taken with telephoto lenses of Ruby May walking the twins to school, accompanying them to doctor's appointments, sitting with them at the park. The captions used coded language that skirted libel laws while making their meaning unmistakable. Questions about appropriate boundaries and unsuitable influences, and the concerning attachment between the children and their caregiver. The most damaging post showed Ruby May hugging both boys after Miles had fallen from his bicycle, her face etched with the kind of maternal concern that couldn't be faked. The caption read, "When hired help forgets their place, what message does this send about family values?" Within hours, the posts had been shared hundreds of times, each share adding layers of commentary that grew progressively more vicious. The anonymity of the internet had unleashed a torrent of racial hatred that Marcus had naively believed his wealth and social position could shield them from. Ruby May had discovered the posts when other parents at the twins' school began treating her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She'd said nothing to Marcus initially, hoping the attention would die down, but when photographers began following her bus route and camping outside her trailer in East Palo Alto, she'd been forced to reveal the scope of the harassment. That evening, as they'd sat in his office reviewing printed screenshots of the most hateful posts, Marcus had felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. He'd lived his entire life insulated by privilege, assuming that good intentions and colorblind attitudes were sufficient to navigate racial complexities. But seeing Ruby May's quiet dignity in the face of attacks that questioned her very right to love his children had forced him to confront the naive inadequacy of his worldview. "I can leave," Ruby May had said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears Marcus could see threatening to spill over. "If my presence is causing problems for you and the boys, I can find another position. Mrs. Chen from next door has a sister who needs help, and there's always more cleaning work available." The casual way she'd mentioned disappearing from their lives had hit Marcus like a physical blow. In that moment, he'd realized that Ruby May had been preparing for this eventuality all along, not because she wanted to leave, but because experience had taught her that people like her were always disposable when social pressure mounted. "No," he'd said, the word coming out with more force than he'd intended. "Absolutely not. You're not going anywhere. We'll hire security if we have to. We'll sue for harassment, whatever it takes." But even as he'd made the promise, Marcus had known that money and lawyers couldn't solve the fundamental problem they faced. The attacks weren't really about Ruby May's qualifications or the appropriateness of their arrangement. They were about the audacity of a black woman claiming a place in a white family's heart, and the challenge that posed to comfortable assumptions about who belonged where in American society. The real test had come the following week, when Mason's teacher had called to request a conference about his increasingly disruptive behavior in class. Marcus had arrived at Meadowbrook Academy expecting to discuss typical childhood adjustment issues, but had instead walked into what felt like an intervention. Mrs. Patterson, Mason's teacher, had been joined by the school counselor and the principal, a show of force that immediately put Marcus on guard. They'd presented their concerns with the diplomatic language of professional educators, but their message had been clear. Mason's attachment to Ruby May was becoming problematic, interfering with his ability to form appropriate relationships with authority figures who looked like his father rather than his nanny. "He talks about Mama Ruby constantly," Mrs. Patterson had explained, her tone suggesting this was somehow pathological. "When he's upset, he asks to call her instead of you. During our unit on families, he drew a picture of himself with a black woman instead of including his deceased mother. We're concerned about confused identity formation during this crucial developmental period." Marcus had felt the careful control he'd maintained for months beginning to fracture. These well-meaning educators, with their advanced degrees and child development training, were pathologizing his son's recovery because it didn't fit their expectations of how grief should look or who should be allowed to heal it. But it was the principal's final comment that had shattered his remaining composure. Perhaps it would be beneficial to transition Mason toward a more traditional caregiving arrangement. Someone who could provide appropriate modeling for his future role in society. Marcus had left that meeting with the terrible understanding that the battle for his family's right to exist as they'd chosen was just beginning. The courtroom at Santa Clara County Family Court felt like a gladiator arena, dressed in mahogany and brass, its high ceilings echoing with the weight of decisions that would shatter lives or bind them together. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his $1,000 suit feeling like armor that offered no real protection against what was coming. Beside him, his attorney Sarah Chen shuffled through documents with the mechanical precision of someone who'd fought these battles before and knew how rarely justice aligned with love. Across the aisle, Victoria Caldwell commanded her own legal fortress, flanked by two associates whose combined hourly rates could fund a small country's healthcare system. She'd transformed for court into something harder than her usual predatory elegance, steel wrapped in Chanel, her blonde hair pulled back in a chignon that suggested military precision. When she looked at Marcus, her eyes held the cold satisfaction of someone who'd been planning this moment since Eleanor's funeral. The custody petition she'd filed painted Marcus as an unfit father whose judgment had been compromised by grief and desperation. But the real target was Ruby May, whose presence in the twins' lives had been dissected with surgical cruelty. Victoria's legal team had compiled a devastating portfolio. Photographs of Ruby May hugging the children at school pickup, records of her overnight stays during the boys' illness, testimony from concerned parents about the unusual attachment between caregiver and children. Judge Margaret Rodriguez entered with the bearing of someone who'd spent 20 years separating children from the people they loved for their own good. Her reputation was legendary, fair but rigid, immune to emotional appeals, guided by strict adherence to what the law considered appropriate rather than what hearts knew to be true. She'd built her career on hard decisions that left courtrooms full of tears but satisfied appellate courts. "In the matter of Caldwell versus Sterling," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of Solomon without the wisdom, "this court will determine the best interests of Mason and Miles Sterling regarding custody arrangements and the appropriateness of current caregiving situations." Victoria's attorney, Richard Blackstone, rose with the predatory grace of a shark sensing blood in the water. His opening statement was a masterpiece of coded language and subtle prejudice, never explicitly mentioning race but painting a picture of boundaries crossed and propriety abandoned. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying the honeyed poison of a Southern gentleman educated at Harvard, "we're here because two grieving children have been placed in a situation that, while well-intentioned, has become emotionally and psychologically harmful. Mr. Sterling, in his understandable desperation to help his sons cope with their mother's tragic death, has allowed an employee to assume a parental role for which she is neither qualified nor appropriate." He gestured toward a display board showing photographs of Ruby May with the twins, images that looked innocent to loving eyes but sinister through the lens of suspicion. "These children, Your Honor, have transferred their grief and need for maternal figures onto a woman who, despite her good intentions, lacks the educational background, cultural context, and social positioning to prepare them for their roles as inheritors of a significant family legacy." Marcus felt his hands clench beneath the table as Blackstone continued his character assassination disguised as child advocacy. Every photograph became evidence of inappropriate attachment, every kindness twisted into proof of overstepping boundaries. The lawyer painted Ruby May as a well-meaning but dangerous influence who'd encouraged the children to forget their real mother in favor of a fantasy replacement who couldn't possibly understand their world. "Furthermore," Blackstone pressed, his voice rising with manufactured outrage, "Mr. Sterling has allowed this employee to spend nights in his children's bedrooms, to make unilateral decisions about their care, and to encourage them to call her by maternal titles. This isn't child care, Your Honor. It's emotional manipulation by someone who has inserted herself into a family structure where she doesn't belong." When Ruby May was called to testify, Marcus watched her walk to the witness stand with the dignity of someone who'd faced worse trials than this courtroom. She wore her best dress, navy blue with small flowers that Eleanor would have admired, and carried herself with the quiet strength that had first drawn his children to her side. But Marcus could see the cost of these months of harassment in the new lines around her eyes, the careful way she held her shoulders as if bracing for the next blow. Blackstone's cross-examination was surgical in its cruelty. He questioned her education with condescending gentleness, her financial situation with false concern, her qualifications with patronizing disbelief. Each question was designed to highlight the gulf between her world and the twins, to paint her love as presumption and her success as accident. "Miss Johnson," he said, consulting his notes with theatrical precision, "you never completed high school. Is that correct?" "I got my GED when I was 42, Ruby May replied, her voice steady despite the implied criticism. "And your employment history shows a pattern of domestic work, cleaning, childcare for minimum wage, manual labor. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir. Honest work that I'm proud of." Blackstone's smile held no warmth. "I'm sure you are. But tell me, Miss Johnson, what qualifies you to guide children who will inherit a billion-dollar empire? What experience do you have with the educational expectations, social requirements, and cultural competencies these boys will need?" Marcus watched Ruby May's face as she absorbed the question's poisonous implications. For a moment, her composure wavered, and he saw the 58 years of being told she wasn't good enough, smart enough, worthy enough to matter in places where money talked louder than love. But then, something shifted in her expression, a steel that hadn't been there before, forged in the crucible of months spent protecting two broken children while the world questioned her right to care. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd earned every word, "you ask, what qualifies me to love those boys? I'll tell you what qualifies me. I know what it feels like to lose everything that matters and keep getting up anyway. I know how to hold a child while he screams about missing his mama without trying to make him stop feeling what he needs to feel. I know how to teach a 5-year-old that anger is just hurt wearing a disguise, and that it's okay to be scared as long as you don't let the fear make decisions for you." She leaned forward slightly, addressing not just the lawyer but the entire courtroom. "You want to know about cultural competencies? I've taught those boys that love comes in all colors and speaks every language. I've shown them that worth isn't measured by money in the bank, but by how you treat people who can't do anything for you. And I've proven every single day that the best education in the world can't teach what a heart full of love knows instinctively." The courtroom fell silent, except for the scratch of the court reporter's keys. Marcus felt tears threatening to spill over as Ruby May continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Those boys sleep through the night now because someone convinced them they're worth staying awake to protect. They eat their vegetables because someone made it a game instead of a battle. They talk about their mama Eleanor with love instead of just grief, because someone taught them that remembering the good doesn't dishonor the dead." She looked directly at Victoria, her dark eyes blazing with protective fury. "You want to take me away from them because you think I'm not good enough for your family? But here's what I know that you don't. Those boys don't need someone who looks right on paper. They need someone who shows up when they're scared, who stays when they're difficult, who loves them not because they're perfect, but because they're theirs." Blackstone had tried to interrupt several times, objecting to the narrative and speeches, but Judge Rodriguez had allowed Ruby May to continue, something in the woman's testimony cutting through the legal posturing to reach the human truth beneath. When Ruby May finished, the silence in the courtroom felt sacred, as if everyone present had witnessed something rare and precious, the kind of love that asks for nothing but the privilege of giving everything. But courtrooms weren't churches, and legal proceedings rarely recognized love as evidence. Judge Rodriguez called a recess, and Marcus watched Ruby May return to her seat with the terrible knowledge that her beautiful testimony might not be enough to overcome the ugly mathematics of custody law. During the break, Victoria approached Marcus with the predatory confidence of someone who sensed victory approaching. "This doesn't have to get uglier," she said, her voice carrying false sympathy. "I'm prepared to offer a compromise. You keep primary custody, I get significant visitation rights, and the woman goes, everyone wins." Marcus looked at his sister-in-law, this woman who shared Eleanor's blood, but none of her capacity for unconditional love, and felt something crystallize in his chest. "No deal," he said quietly. "Ruby May stays, or I'll fight you until one of us is destroyed." Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the wounded, desperate woman beneath the legal predator. "Those boys need stability, Marcus. They need family. Real family." "They have it," Marcus replied, looking across the courtroom to where Ruby May sat with quiet dignity, her weathered hands folded in her lap like a prayer. "They have exactly what they need." As court reconvened for closing arguments, Marcus realized that the next hour would determine whether love could triumph over law, whether the family they'd built from grief and grace could survive the brutal arithmetic of a system that measured worth in degrees and bank accounts rather than midnight lullabies and patient comfort. The twins' future hung in the balance, and all he could do was pray that Judge Rodriguez possessed the wisdom to see what his heart knew with absolute certainty, that Ruby May Johnson wasn't just their nanny or their caregiver or their employee, she was their salvation, and losing her would destroy them all over again. Judge Rodriguez's gavel fell like a guillotine blade, the sound echoing through the courtroom with the finality of shattered dreams. "After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented," she announced, her voice carrying the cold authority of Solomon without his wisdom, "this court finds that the current caregiving arrangement, while well-intentioned, has created an unhealthy emotional dependence that is not in the best interests of the minor children." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each syllable driving deeper into his chest until he couldn't breathe. Beside him, Sarah Chen's pen froze mid-note, her professional composure cracking as she realized they'd lost everything. Across the courtroom, Ruby May sat perfectly still, her weathered hands folded in her lap like a prayer that had gone unanswered, her dark eyes reflecting a pain so profound it seemed to absorb all light. "Effective immediately," Judge Rodriguez continued, oblivious to the devastation she was creating, "Ruby May Johnson's employment with the Sterling household is terminated. Temporary custody of Mason and Miles Sterling is awarded to Victoria Caldwell, pending a 30-day evaluation period to determine permanent placement." The courtroom erupted in whispers and shuffling papers, but Marcus heard only the sound of his own heart breaking. Victoria's triumphant smile felt like salt in an open wound, her victory complete and devastating. She'd won not through love or understanding, but through the brutal calculus of a system that valued credentials over compassion, social position over sacrifice. Ruby May rose from her seat with the dignity of someone who'd faced worse defeats and survived them. She didn't look at Marcus, didn't acknowledge Victoria's victory, didn't display any of the emotions that must have been tearing her apart inside. She simply gathered her small purse, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the courtroom exit with her head held high. But as she reached the door, it burst open with explosive force. Mason and Miles Sterling, still in their school uniforms, broke free from the social worker who'd been tasked with collecting them. They'd somehow learned about the hearing, perhaps overhearing whispered conversations between teachers, and had convinced their school driver to bring them to the courthouse. "Mama Ruby!" Mason screamed, launching himself into her arms with the desperate intensity of someone clinging to a lifeline. "They said you have to leave. They said we can't see you anymore." Miles, always his brother's protector, wrapped his arms around Ruby May's waist and glared at the assembled adults with fury that belonged to someone much older. "She's our mama now. You can't take her away." "We won't let you." The courtroom fell silent except for the sounds of children's sobs and Ruby May's gentle whispers of comfort. Judge Rodriguez looked stricken, perhaps seeing for the first time the human cost of her legal decision. Victoria's triumph faltered as she watched her nephews cling to the woman she'd just succeeded in banishing from their lives. "Boys," Ruby May said softly, kneeling to their level and cupping their faces in her hands, Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense to little hearts. But that doesn't mean the love goes away. Love doesn't live in houses or courtrooms. It lives in here. She touched each boy's chest over his heart. And nobody can take that away. "But where will you go?" Mason whispered, his green eyes, Eleanor's eyes, swimming with tears. "Who will sing the bedtime songs? Who will make pancakes shaped like butterflies?" Ruby May's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face as she pulled both boys close. "Your daddy will learn the songs," she promised, her voice breaking. "And maybe someday, when you're older, you'll remember that someone loved you enough to fight for you, even when she couldn't win." The bailiff approached with reluctant authority, tasked with enforcing the court's order. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the children." But Miles Sterling, all of 5 years old, stepped between Ruby May and the officer with protective instincts that belonged to someone 10 times his age. "No!" he shouted, his small fists clenched at his sides. "You can't have her. She's ours." The standoff lasted only moments, but it felt like eternity. Finally, Ruby May gently moved Miles aside and stood to face the inevitable. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. Sometimes loving someone means knowing when to let go. She kissed each boy's forehead with the reverence of a benediction, her lips lingering as if trying to memorize the feel of their skin, the smell of their hair, the weight of their small bodies in her arms. Then she straightened, looked directly at Victoria with eyes that held no hatred despite everything, and spoke words that would echo in that courtroom for years to come. "Those boys are the best thing I've ever done with my life," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute truth. "Take good care of them. They deserve better than what this world has given them so far." With that, Ruby May Johnson walked out of the courtroom and, seemingly, out of their lives forever. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Victoria, armed with court orders and social workers, descended on the Sterling mansion like a conquering army. She arrived with moving trucks and a team of child specialists who spoke in therapeutic jargon about transition periods and healthy detachment. The boys' belongings were packed with military efficiency, their protests ignored, their tears dismissed as natural adjustment reactions. Marcus watched helplessly as his children were loaded into Victoria's Mercedes like prisoners being transported to a new jail. Mason pressed his face against the window, his mouth forming the word "Daddy" over and over, while Miles kicked at his car seat with impotent rage. Victoria's own car followed, filled with legal documents and the self-satisfied glow of someone who believed she'd saved 2 children from an inappropriate situation. The mansion fell silent with a completeness that felt like death. Marcus walked through rooms that echoed with ghosts. Ruby May's laughter from the kitchen where she'd taught the boys to make biscuits from scratch. The twins' voices calling for Mama Ruby during their nightmares. The sound of 3 hearts healing together in a space that had known only grief before she arrived. He found himself in the boys' bedroom, staring at the evidence of lives interrupted. Mason's art supplies sat abandoned on his desk, a half-finished drawing of their family still taped to the easel. Miles's carefully organized rock collection remained on the windowsill, each specimen labeled in Ruby May's patient handwriting. Their beds were perfectly made, waiting for children who would never sleep in them again. That night, Marcus sat in his office with a bottle of scotch and a phone that wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted statements about the custody battle. Business partners expressed carefully neutral concern about the situation, and well-meaning friends offered condolences that felt like funeral arrangements for the living. But it was the call from Dr. Hensley, the boys' therapist, that shattered what remained of his composure. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her professional calm barely containing her distress. "I've just finished emergency sessions with both boys. Mason hasn't spoken since yesterday. Complete selective mutism. Miles is displaying signs of severe abandonment trauma. They're asking for Ruby May constantly, and I don't know how to explain to 5-year-olds why the legal system just destroyed the only stability they've known since their mother's death." Marcus closed his eyes, seeing Ruby May's face as she'd walked away from the courthouse, dignified in defeat, broken but not bitter, carrying her grief like someone who'd had too much practice. He thought about her trailer in East Palo Alto, empty now except for memories and the ghosts of children who'd needed her more than the law would allow. The irony was devastating. In trying to protect his sons from an inappropriate attachment, the system had traumatized them more thoroughly than their mother's death had managed. They'd been torn away from the person who'd taught them to trust again, to love without fear, to believe that some people stay even when staying is hard. As midnight approached, Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. He picked up his phone and dialed Ruby May's number, not knowing if she'd answer, not knowing what he could possibly say to repair the damage that had been done. When her voice came through the line, tired, defeated, but still carrying that note of warmth that had first drawn his children to her side, he spoke the words that had been building in his chest since the moment she'd walked away. "Ruby May," he said, his voice breaking with the weight of everything they'd lost. "I'm going to fix this. I don't know how, but I'm going to bring you home." The silence stretched between them, filled with the ghosts of lullabies and breakfast conversations and all the small moments that had made them a family. Finally, Ruby May spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Those babies need their mama, Mr. Sterling, and I need them too." The revelation came not through divine intervention or legal breakthrough, but through the trembling hands of an 82-year-old woman with Alzheimer's who had been trying to tell the truth for months. Catherine Sterling sat in her room at Sunset Manor, surrounded by the detritus of a mind slowly losing its grip on reality, when she suddenly became lucid with the startling clarity that sometimes precedes death. Marcus had been visiting daily since losing the boys, finding in his mother's fractured memories a refuge from his own unbearable present. He'd been reading to her from one of Eleanor's favorite novels when Kate suddenly gripped his wrist with surprising strength, her clouded eyes blazing with urgent purpose. "The box," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of secrets too long buried. "Eleanor's box, under the floorboards in her closet. She made me promise never to tell, but those babies, they need to know the truth." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What truth, Mom? What box?" Kate's grip tightened, her fingernails digging into his skin with desperate intensity. "She couldn't have children, Marcus. The cancer treatment when she was 16, it left her barren as desert sand. But she wanted babies so badly it was killing her from the inside out. She found that poor girl at the hospital where I worked, pregnant and alone with nowhere to turn." The words tumbled out of Kate with the urgency of a dam bursting. 15 years of carefully guarded secrets pouring forth in a torrent of truth that would reshape everything Marcus thought he knew about his life. Eleanor told everyone she was pregnant, wore those fake bellies, even fooled the doctors with forged records and bribes. But when that poor Ruby May Johnson gave birth to her twins, Eleanor was right there waiting. She had papers ready, money changing hands, people paid to look the other way. That girl never had a chance. Marcus felt the room spinning around him, his carefully constructed reality crumbling like sand castles before a tsunami. "You're saying the twins are—" "Ruby May's babies," Kate finished, her voice breaking with the weight of complicity she'd carried all these years. "Born at County General on a Tuesday night in March, Eleanor registered them as her own before that poor child even woke up from the anesthesia, said it was better this way, that Ruby May was too young, too poor, too black to give them the life they deserved. The lucidity faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Kate staring at Marcus with confused eyes that no longer recognized her own son. But the damage was done, the truth finally released after years of imprisonment in a diseased mind. That night, Marcus tore through Eleanor's closet like a man possessed, pulling up floorboards with his bare hands until he found what Kate had described: a metal document box hidden beneath the subflooring, secured with a lock that he broke open with savage determination. Inside were the documents that would change everything: birth certificates with Ruby May's name scratched out and Eleanor's written over in different ink, hospital records showing payments to staff members for their silence, photographs of a terrified 16-year-old girl holding two newborn babies with the bewildered expression of someone who didn't understand what was happening to her life. But it was Eleanor's diary that delivered the killing blow to everything he'd believed about their marriage. Page after page of anguished confessions, detailed plans for the deception, and most damaging of all, her growing guilt as she watched Ruby May working at the hospital, cleaning the floors where her stolen children had been born. "She cleans the maternity ward now," one entry read, Eleanor's elegant handwriting betraying her torment. "I see her sometimes when I bring the boys for checkups. She's so young, barely 17, and there's such sadness in her eyes. I tell myself I saved her from a life of poverty and struggle, but I know the truth. I stole her children because I wanted them more than she deserved them. God forgive me, but I can't give them back now. I love them too much." The final entry, dated just weeks before Eleanor's death, shattered what remained of Marcus's illusions. "Ruby May applied for a job as a nanny through the agency today. She doesn't know who I am, doesn't recognize me from that terrible night 5 years ago. She just wants to work with children because she lost her own. The irony is unbearable. I want to tell her the truth, want to fall to my knees and beg her forgiveness, but I'm too much of a coward. I'm going to die with this secret. And Marcus will never know that the woman he married built their happiness on another woman's stolen dreams." Marcus sat on his bedroom floor, surrounded by the wreckage of his life, understanding finally why Ruby May had connected so instantly with his sons, why she'd known exactly how to comfort them, why her love had felt so fierce and protective. She hadn't been caring for his children. She'd been loving her own babies, stolen from her arms when she was barely more than a child herself. The weight of Eleanor's deception pressed down on him like a physical force. Every happy memory of their marriage was tainted now, every moment of joy built on Ruby May's unconscious sacrifice. His wife, the woman he'd mourned and idealized, had been a kidnapper, using her wealth and privilege to steal children from a girl too poor and powerless to fight back. But worse than the betrayal was the realization of what they'd done to Ruby May in court. She'd stood there and listened to lawyers question her fitness to care for her own biological children, watched judges award custody to a woman who had no blood connection while she, their actual mother, was dismissed as inappropriate help. The next morning, Marcus called his lawyer with shaking hands, the documents spread before him like evidence at a crime scene. Sarah Chen's gasp when he explained what he'd found was audible even through the phone. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight with disbelief, "this changes everything. These documents prove fraud, kidnapping, falsification of records. The original custody ruling is null and void. Ruby May has standing to file for full custody as the biological mother." But legal vindication felt hollow against the magnitude of what had been stolen from Ruby May. She'd spent 5 years cleaning hospitals and taking minimum wage jobs while her own children grew up in a mansion, calling another woman mother. She'd watched them grieve for Eleanor's death while never knowing they should have been grieving for their separation from her. Marcus drove to East Palo Alto that afternoon, the documents secured in a briefcase that felt heavier than lead. Ruby May's trailer sat in the midst of a complex that spoke of lives lived on society's margins: rusted cars, struggling gardens, children playing in dirt yards because there was nowhere else to go. The contrast with his Palo Alto mansion was so stark, it felt like traveling between different countries. Ruby May opened the door wearing the same navy dress she'd worn to court, but now it hung loose on her diminished frame. The harassment and legal battle had aged her years in mere weeks, carving new lines around her eyes and stealing the quiet strength that had first drawn his children to her. "Mr. Sterling," she said with weary politeness, stepping aside to let him enter her tiny living space. "I wasn't expecting you." The trailer's interior was spotless but sparse, decorated with photographs of children she'd cared for over the years, a gallery of borrowed love that had substituted for the family stolen from her. On a small table sat 2 school photographs that made Marcus's breath catch. Mason and Miles, their faces bright with innocence, positioned like shrine offerings to dreams she couldn't name but couldn't abandon. "Ruby May," Marcus began, his voice breaking on her name. "I need to show you something. Something that changes everything." He opened the briefcase with trembling hands, watching her face as he revealed the birth certificates, the photographs, the diary entries that proved what her heart had somehow always known. Ruby May's hands flew to her mouth as the truth hit her like a physical blow, her legs giving out so suddenly that Marcus had to catch her before she fell. "My babies," she whispered, staring at the hospital photographs with dawning comprehension. "Oh God, my babies, I knew. Somehow I always knew, but I thought I was going crazy. The way they looked at me, the way they fit in my arms like they'd been made for them." The tears came then, years of suppressed grief pouring out in torrents that shook her entire body. Marcus held her while she sobbed, this woman he'd employed as a servant while she unknowingly cared for the children torn from her arms, and felt shame so profound it threatened to destroy him. "I'm so sorry," he kept repeating, the words inadequate against the magnitude of what had been done to her. "God, Ruby May, I'm so sorry. If I'd known, if I'd had any idea." But Ruby May pulled away from his embrace, her tears stopping as suddenly as they'd begun. When she looked at him, her eyes held not hatred, but something far more devastating: pity for a man who'd lived his entire life as an unwitting participant in his wife's cruelty. "Those poor babies," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "They've lost 2 mothers now. First me, when they were too young to remember, and then Eleanor, when they were old enough to grieve. And now they're with Victoria, who sees them as possessions instead of people." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the playground where other people's children played, their laughter a bitter reminder of all she'd missed. "How do we tell them?" she asked. "How do we explain that their whole life has been a lie? That the woman they're mourning stole them from the woman standing right here?" Marcus joined her at the window, both of them staring at a future that seemed impossible to navigate. "We tell them the truth," he said finally. "All of it. And then we fight like hell to bring them home where they belong." Ruby May turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd known her, Marcus saw steel in her expression, the hardened resolve of a mother who'd found her cubs and would kill anyone who tried to take them again. "Mr. Sterling," she said, and her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd just discovered she held all the power in the room. "Those are my children. Not Eleanor's, not Victoria's, not even yours in the eyes of the law. Mine. And I want them back." The woman who'd spent months accepting her place as hired help had transformed into something far more dangerous: a mother with legal standing, documented proof, and 15 years of stolen love to reclaim. The war for Mason and Miles Sterling was about to begin in earnest, and this time Ruby Mae Johnson held all the weapons. The emergency custody hearing convened 3 days later in the same courtroom where Ruby Mae had been dismissed as unfit help, but this time she sat at the plaintiff's table as the biological mother seeking to reclaim her stolen children. The transformation was stark. No longer the quietly dignified woman accepting society's judgment, but a force of nature armed with DNA evidence, birth certificates, and the righteous fury of 15 years of unconscious grief. Judge Rodriguez looked visibly shaken as she reviewed the documents that had turned her previous ruling into a legal nightmare. Eleanor's diary lay open before her, its elegant handwriting detailing a deception so elaborate it had fooled hospitals, courts, and an entire social circle. The birth certificates with their obvious alterations, the hospital photographs showing a drugged teenage Ruby Mae holding newborn twins, and most damning of all, the financial records showing payments to staff members for their silence. Everything painted a picture of systematic fraud that had stolen 2 children from their mother's arms. Victoria Caldwell sat across the aisle looking like someone who'd been caught in an avalanche. Her legal team huddled around documents they'd never seen before, their previous confident assertions about inappropriate attachments crumbling in the face of biological truth. The woman who'd argued so passionately about blood ties and family connections now found herself on the wrong side of both. Sarah Chen rose to present Ruby Mae's case with the controlled fury of someone who'd discovered her client had been fighting for her own children without knowing it. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority, "this court stands witness to one of the most egregious cases of child trafficking disguised as private adoption in California legal history. Ruby Mae Johnson didn't develop an inappropriate attachment to the Sterling children. She responded with biological instinct to her own stolen babies." The courtroom fell silent except for the scratch of reporters' pens as Sarah methodically dismantled every argument Victoria had made. Ruby Mae's poverty became irrelevant when weighed against her biological rights. Her lack of formal education paled beside her natural maternal instincts. Her race, which had been subtly questioned throughout the previous hearing, was revealed as part of the reason Eleanor had felt she could steal with impunity. Eleanor Sterling targeted Ruby Mae Johnson precisely because she was young, black, and powerless. Sarah continued, her voice rising with indignation. She exploited a 16-year-old girl's desperation, used her wealth to corrupt hospital staff, and built her entire marriage on stolen motherhood. The only inappropriate attachment in this case was Eleanor Sterling's pathological need to possess children who were never legally or morally hers. When Ruby Mae took the stand, she didn't speak with the careful deference that had characterized her previous testimony. This time, she spoke with the authority of a mother reclaiming her cubs, her voice carrying 15 years of unconscious longing, finally given voice and purpose. "Your Honor," she said, looking directly at Judge Rodriguez with eyes that held no forgiveness for the system that had failed her, "I want you to understand what was taken from me. Not just my babies, but their first steps, their first words, their first days of school. I cleaned the hospital where they were born, walked past the maternity ward where they took their first breaths, never knowing I was walking on holy ground because my children had been there." She gestured toward the photographs spread across the evidence table. Images of herself at 16, terrified and alone, holding twins she'd never been allowed to name. "Eleanor Sterling didn't just steal my babies. She stole my identity as their mother. She made me complicit in my own loss by hiring me to care for them, watching me love them with an intensity I couldn't explain, knowing the whole time that she'd built her happiness on my unconscious grief." Ruby Mae's voice broke slightly, but she pressed on with the determination of someone who'd found her power after a lifetime of being told she had none. "Those boys called me Mama Ruby because something in their DNA recognized me. They slept peacefully in my arms because I'd held them first when they were brand new and perfect and mine. The love Victoria Caldwell tried to paint as inappropriate was actually the most appropriate thing in the world, a mother loving her children. The cross-examination that had devastated Ruby May in the previous hearing crumbled before the fortress of biological truth. Victoria's attorney, Richard Blackstone, found himself trying to argue against DNA evidence and documented fraud with nothing but class prejudice and social expectations. His questions about Ruby May's qualifications to raise wealthy children rang hollow when those children were proven to be hers by birth. "Miss Johnson," he tried desperately, "even accepting these revelations about the children's origins, can you provide the educational advantages, cultural opportunities, and social positioning these boys will need as they mature?" Ruby May's answer cut through his pretensions like a blade through silk. "Mr. Blackstone, I've already provided the most important thing those boys will ever need: a mother's love. Everything else is just details." Victoria herself seemed to shrink as the hearing progressed, her previous certainty replaced by the growing realization that she'd built her custody case on foundation of quicksand. When called to testify about her fitness as a guardian, she found herself defending her right to raise children who weren't related to her at all, while the woman she'd dismissed as hired help was revealed to be their actual mother. The most devastating moment came when Mason and Miles were brought into the courtroom for the judge's private interview. The boys, who'd been listless and withdrawn during their week with Victoria, transformed the moment they saw Ruby May. They broke free from the social worker's hands and ran to her with desperate relief, their cries of "Mama Ruby!" echoing through the formal chamber like prayers finally answered. Judge Rodriguez watched this reunion with tears in her eyes, seeing clearly what her previous ruling had torn apart. Not an inappropriate attachment, but the most natural bond in the world. When she asked the boys who they wanted to live with, their answer came in perfect unison: "Our real mama." "But I thought Eleanor was your real mama," the judge said gently, trying to understand how 5-year-olds were processing this revelation. Miles, with the brutal honesty of childhood, answered in a way that silenced the entire courtroom. "Mama Eleanor loved us, but Mama Ruby is where we came from. Daddy told us the truth, and now we understand why our hearts always knew she was ours." The ruling came without deliberation. Judge Rodriguez, visibly moved by the magnitude of injustice that had been perpetrated, didn't even retire to chambers. "This court hereby reverses its previous custody decision and awards full legal and physical custody of Mason and Miles Johnson Sterling to their biological mother, Ruby May Johnson, effective immediately." The name change was deliberate and pointed. No longer would the boys carry only their false father's surname, but would bear their mother's name as well, a legal recognition of the identity that had been stolen from them. Victoria's collapse was swift and complete. The woman who'd entered the courthouse that morning, convinced of her moral authority, left as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumptions and prejudice. Her legal team abandoned her within hours, unwilling to be associated with a case that had become a public relations nightmare. But the real transformation occurred in the Sterling mansion that evening, when Ruby May Johnson returned not as an employee, but as the rightful mother of the children who lived there. Marcus had spent the day removing all traces of Eleanor's deception. Photographs, documents, anything that perpetuated the lie his marriage had been built on. He met Ruby May at the front door, the same entrance where she'd arrived months earlier as a desperate job applicant. This time she carried herself with the dignity of someone who belonged, who had every right to be there because her children were there. "Welcome home," Marcus said simply, and the words carried weight that went far beyond politeness. Ruby May looked around the foyer where she'd once waited nervously for job interviews, seeing it now through different eyes. This wasn't just a wealthy man's house. It was where her children had grown up, where they'd learned to walk and talk and dream. Every room held memories that were rightfully hers, stolen moments she was finally free to claim. Mason and Miles clung to her sides as she walked through their home, pointing out treasures she'd helped them create. Artwork on refrigerator doors, reading nooks she'd arranged. The garden where she'd taught them to identify different flowers. Each discovery was a piece of her motherhood returned, a fragment of the life Eleanor had tried to erase. That night, as Ruby May tucked her sons into beds that were finally, legally, theirs to share, she felt the last piece of a 15-year puzzle clicking into place. The aching emptiness that had haunted her since that terrible night in the hospital was filled at last, not with substitute love or borrowed affection, but with the real thing, her own children, in her own arms, where they'd always belonged. Marcus found her later, sitting in the twins' bedroom, watching them sleep with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who'd nearly lost everything twice. They didn't speak about the future, about how they'd navigate their strange new family dynamic, about the legal and social complexities that lay ahead. For now, it was enough that the impossible had become inevitable, that love had triumphed over law, that truth had conquered deception, and that a black maid from East Palo Alto had indeed done the impossible. She'd gotten her children back. 5 years later, the Sterling Johnson household had become something unprecedented in Palo Alto society, a testament to love's power to transcend every boundary that money and prejudice could construct. Ruby May stood in the kitchen of what was now truly her home, watching 17-year-old Mason teach his younger adopted sister how to make biscuits from scratch, while Miles, now a sophomore at Stanford, helped Marcus review scholarship applications for their foundation. The Stolen Children Recovery Foundation had reunited over 200 families torn apart by illegal adoptions, using Eleanor's seized assets to fund investigations and legal battles. Ruby May served as its director, her face gracing magazine covers as the mother who changed America, though she preferred her original title, Mama Ruby. The boys had thrived beyond every prediction, their academic achievements matched only by their emotional resilience. They spoke openly about their unique origin story, having written a children's book titled The Mama Who Never Gave Up, that had become required reading in social work programs nationwide. Mason's art installations about identity and belonging had won national recognition, while Miles studied law with plans to reform adoption practices. Marcus had married Ruby May 3 years earlier in a ceremony that made international headlines, not for its interracial nature but for its representation of love conquering systematic injustice. They'd become unlikely symbols of possibility in an America still grappling with questions of who belongs where and why. The mansion's walls now displayed 3 family portraits: Eleanor with the boys as toddlers, Ruby May with them as babies in the hospital, and their current family of 7, including Mrs. Chen and 2 other children they'd fostered through the difficult transition from institutional care to unconditional love. Victoria had spent 2 years in prison for her role in perpetuating the fraud, emerging to find her legal license permanently revoked and her social standing demolished. She'd eventually approached Ruby May with a request that shocked everyone. Could she volunteer at the foundation, helping other families navigate the complex emotions of reunion? Ruby May had said yes, understanding that healing sometimes requires former enemies to work side by side. Dr. Hensley, the children's therapist, published papers about the Sterling Johnson case that revolutionized understanding of biological bonding and institutional bias. Her research demonstrated how Ruby May's instant connection with the twins hadn't been emotional manipulation, but biological recognition. A mother's DNA calling to her stolen children across the artificial barriers constructed by wealth and prejudice. The most profound changes, however, were invisible to cameras and reporters. They lived in quiet moments. Ruby May reading bedtime stories to grandchildren who would grow up knowing their complete history. Mason teaching his own children to paint their feelings instead of hiding them. Miles arguing cases before the Supreme Court with the moral authority of someone who'd witnessed justice delayed but not denied. On this particular evening, as three generations gathered around the dinner table that had once echoed with grief, Ruby May offered the blessing she'd spoken every night for 5 years. Lord, thank you for bringing our family home to each other. Help us remember that love doesn't require permission from the world. It just requires the courage to stay when staying is hard. Marcus reached for her hand. These two people who'd found each other through their children's needs and stayed together through choice, commitment, and the daily decision to build something beautiful from the wreckage of deception and loss. The twins, no longer twins in age but forever bonded by their shared journey from stolen children to empowered adults, sat with their own families, living proof that the impossible had become inevitable, that a black maid from East Palo Alto had indeed done the impossible. She'd not only gotten her children back, she'd transformed a broken system, challenged a prejudiced society, and proven that love, when armed with truth and determination, could move mountains, change laws, and rewrite the very definition of family in America. As the evening wound down and multiple generations prepared for bed under the same roof that had once housed only grief, Ruby May Johnson Sterling walked through her home with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd fought the longest battle of her life and won not just victory, but vindication. The mansion that had been Eleanor's monument to stolen dreams had become Ruby May's testament to reclaimed love, and every room whispered the same truth. Home isn't where you're born, but where someone fights to keep you, and where love finally gets the last word. Message for American seniors. This story touches something deep in the hearts of those who've lived long enough to understand that family isn't always what it appears to be on the surface. At 55-68, you've probably seen how life can separate people who belong together. Through divorce, misunderstandings, distance, or even death. Ruby May's journey reminds us that real love doesn't give up, even when the world says it should. Her story proves that it's never too late for justice, never too late for truth to surface, and never too late for families to find their way back to each other. In our golden years, we understand that the most precious thing isn't wealth or status. It's the people who stay, who fight for us, who see past our flaws to love us unconditionally. Ruby May showed that sometimes the most unlikely person becomes the answer to our deepest prayers, and that genuine love can overcome any barrier society tries to build. Discussion questions. Have you ever experienced an instant, unexplainable connection with someone that later made perfect sense when you learned more about them? What's the most important lesson about family and belonging that you'd want to pass on to your grandchildren? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your wisdom and stories matter to this community,